welcome to our panel. We have Professor Aaron with us, and we'll be doing a panel workshop about his study about 36 questions that lead to love, and we'll also be seeing the rest of his work as well. I am Stephanie. I'm the audience engagement editor for The Statesman. And Jules, would you like to introduce yourself?
I'm Jules Slocum. I'm the podcast editor at The Statesman.
And Arthur, would you like to introduce yourself as well?
Sure. I'm Art Aaron. I'm a research professor at Stony Brook, and I'm also currently an affiliate of I'm out in Berkeley because my wife lives out there, at the Institute for Personality and Social Research. And I have been for many, many years doing research on close relationships and love.
All right. So our first question is, what are the themes that you focus on while studying how to form and maintain healthy relationships?
Well, from the beginning, the question is, what is love and what does it mean to be in a relationship and to be close to someone? So my research was originally focused and has been mostly focused on understanding the basic mechanisms. But in the process, we've learned a great deal that's useful to people in their daily lives. So while it's primarily basic research, how things work, we've learned a lot about, what leads to or is likely to create attraction, what makes a relationship likely to be successful. And we've come up with some tips and procedures that seem to work and be helpful to people.
So let's talk about your 36 question study. What is this? Could you just introduce it to the audience in case they might not know?
Yes, well, this is a procedure that in about 45 minutes, we can put two strangers together, and after 45 minutes, on the average, they end up 30-40% of them end up as close to their person they're doing it with as the closest person in their life. So it's a procedure for quickly creating closeness. And it was designed as a research tool. In other words, if we want to study how closeness operates, what's going on in your brain when you feel close to someone, what changes in the hormones, what changes in your attitudes, and so forth. If we just take two people who are close and compare them to ones who aren't, they have different histories, they've selected each other and so forth. So this way we can randomly assign people to be close or not and look at the effects. And that's what it was designed for. Now, it's turned out that it's been useful to people to actually apply it in their actual relationships. What it consists of is when we did this, we said, how could we create in the lab closeness quickly? And we looked at all of the research that had been done on how people spontaneously get close. And we tried to collapse that into a short time. And there's really three basics. One is connecting by revealing personal stuff. And it has to be not too much too fast. If someone's saying too much too fast, it sort of puts them off. And it has to be both ways. And so what we did is we came up with a set of questions that people ask each other that gradually escalate in personalness. So did I lose you? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can still hear you. Stephanie's just showing the questions for anybody
fine.
who might not have seen them.
Right, I see. Good. So the idea is that some of the early questions are, it's not very hard to answer those, but then they get more and more personal towards the end. And so that's the key to it. In fact, what we've learned since we originally developed it, it's not so much about revealing personal stuff, it's about the feeling you're heard when you reveal it. It's the responsiveness of the other person. And this provides that opportunity. And there's two other elements that we have mixed in with this. One is a key thing in getting close to someone is feeling you have things in common, that you're similar. Turns out actually being similar only matters a little bit for a relationship, but thinking you're similar matters a lot. And so we have some items early on about, name some things that after a little while, name some things you've noticed you have in common with your partner. We don't ask, name some things you don't have in common. And the other thing that's really important in forming relationships and feeling close, not just romantic, any sort of friendship or thing, is thinking the other person likes you. It's really central to feel the other person likes you. And so again, we have some items that come up as it moves along that ask, name some things that you've noticed you like about the other person. And again, we don't say some things you don't like. We're trying to create closeness quickly. So what we tried to do is to create, and we did a lot of pilot testing in the lab, and came up with these 36 questions. And they're usually given in the lab in 3 sets. The first 12, the second 12, the third 12. We give people 15 minutes to go through as many as they can without rushing. And usually they only get through 7 or 8. And then you go to the second set. The reason we have as many in each set is if they are going through them quickly, we don't want them to run out.
So I have a follow-up question with that. If these are strangers in the lab and you're with the question, what are 3 things you and your partner have in common? How would strangers know those 3 things?
They only know that question doesn't come up until, I don't remember which number it is, until I think the second set or something. So they've already been asking each other questions for 15 minutes or 20 minutes and hearing each other's answers. So that's how they're able to do that. So any other questions about this?
I guess I was wondering what inspired you to begin this study and what was your intention when you were writing them?
Well, the intention was it really was for basic research, to be able to create closeness in the lab with strangers, comparing they're not, we've done brain scan studies and other studies looking at the effect of closeness. We've also done a lot of studies, including one with the entire entering freshman class one year, where there's this whole issue that if you have a friend in another group, another ethnicity or something like that, you tend to have more positive attitudes towards that group. But the question is, what's causing what? Do people who have more friends in another group have more positive attitudes, or does positive attitudes, having a friend, lead to positive attitudes? So what we did was, with the entering freshman seminars, we randomly assigned pairs to do this procedure. And because we're fortunate at Stony Brook to have such diversity, about half the pairs were mixed ethnicity. And then in the surveys that were done later in the semester, separately from the procedure, we asked people about their attitudes towards other groups. And what we found is those who had done the procedure with someone in another group showed considerably less prejudice towards that group, more positive attitudes towards that group than people who had done the procedure with someone in their own group. So it was, and now there's been many other studies that have used the procedure to test that issue. But again, so that was one of the things. We've also looked at, again, how it changes the brain, how it changes your hormones, all sorts of things about how closeness works.
So with that, how does age affect, like say there's an age difference between the 2 strangers, does that have any effect on their interaction?
We haven't actually looked at that in any of our studies, because usually our studies are done with people of about the same age. There was a very neat sort of, I forget what it was, some international group showed some videos where they had brought people together who were immigrants with, people who were not, showing them doing this procedure. And some of them were with, older people with children. We would expect it to work with people of different ages. Parents and children could be a little tricky because you have things you don't want to reveal to your parents, and parents have things they don't want to reveal. But yeah, if you want to get close to someone who's 20 years older or 40 years older, I would think it would work very well. Why not? The only thing there's 2 things I'd recommend about using this procedure in practice. One is if you're using it like on a first date or with a person you'd like to become friends with, it's not designed to create falling in love. It's designed to create closeness. But if you have other things, that would lead to falling in love, and, mostly when we do experiments, we do them with same-sex partners, most of whom are heterosexual, mostly because we don't want to create in a lab setting, we don't want to create a romance between people who might be in other relationships. But some of the studies have used cross-gender pairs, and People do, we've had cases of people falling in love and certainly romantic attraction, but mostly it's about closeness. And if you want to develop closeness with someone, this is a great procedure to do on a first date or something. The only thing I'd advise is don't use the same, if you try this on 10 first dates, your answers are going to get very rote. So, you can invent your own. The other thing is we've done some research in the last few years where we have two couples do it, existing couples. And it turns out that when you do this with another couple, it's not only does it get you close to the other couple, but it gets you closer to your own partner. And in fact, it increases passionate love for your own partner when you do this with another couple. Indeed, my wife and I have done versions of this by Zoom with other couples that we know and don't know that well. And it's been a great way over this thing to have fun and to strengthen our own relationship.
Do you have any other interesting stories to share that from people doing this?
Oh, well, I think we even mentioned as a footnote in our original article that a couple of the research assistants in our lab who were working on other projects and weren't familiar with this at all, we had them, try it out, and they fell in love and got married. And we've heard, since this went wild in the, went viral in the media, we've been getting a lot of stories from people who've used it and, and have fallen in love or have just created a connection with someone that really, really mattered.
Thank you for sharing that. We also saw that you had developed a self-expansion model of motivation in relationships, which kind of deal with your own role in building a relationship. We were wondering, what did you learn from the project and anything that really stood out from doing that study?
Well, it's not just one study. It's been a major theory in the whole relationship field since we developed it some years ago. The notion is that a major goal we have in life is, one goal is to survive, but another goal is to expand, to become more effective and powerful and have greater resources and so forth. And one of the major ways we can do that is by forming a relationship. The other person becomes part of ourself. In fact, we've shown this in a whole bunch of research. You mix up memories with another person. And if we do morphing studies, you have trouble distinguishing someone who's close to you from yourself if they're morphed together than you do other people and so forth. And brain scan studies have done this. So you include the other in self, and thus you expand yourself because they become part of who you are. And when an initial relationship, when you fall in love or you start a relationship, there's huge amount of expansion in that process of including the other. So what is the value of that? Well, it turns out that if you've been in a relationship for a while, you get used to it. If you were to lose the relationship, you would de-self-expand, you'd lose. In fact, in a relationship that didn't provide much of that, it's not as hard to lose it. But one of the things that occurred to us you could do is if you do things that are novel and interesting and exciting, that reinvigorates that sense of expansion. And if you're doing it with your partner, it associates it with the relationship. And there's now been, many, many studies in our lab and other people's labs. We had a big NSF grant to study this initially at Stony Brook, but now it's been done all over the place. And basically, once you're in a relationship and you've been in it for a little while, 6 months, a year or something, and you're starting to get used to it, regularly doing something new and challenging and exciting with your partner. Once a week at least, do something different, something interesting, something novel. Now, it shouldn't be more than you can handle. You don't want it to be over the top, My wife really wanted to go out looking at on a boat to look at whales, and I get seasick. But I said, let's do it. It'd be fun. And well, I fed the whales by leaning over the edge and throwing up on them. But so that wasn't a good idea. But we've done lots of other things, and we regularly do new, interesting, challenging things. We went, to take a dance lesson, or we went, we're not doing as much. Well, now we're starting to because we've been vaccinated. But Like, but we try to do new and different things as much as we can. And it's really a valuable way to spark up a relationship, to keep it from being, sort of just mundane. I mean, one of the things my wife and I do is she does all this research. You may have heard of it on something called the highly sensitive person. And I collaborate with her on that, and she collaborates with me on the relationship research. And although it sounds a little geeky, collaborating on research can be exciting. You spend, months doing the study, and then you sit down with the data. Did it work? What's going on? It's really can be exciting. Of course, go ahead.
We focused on your 36 questions, but can you tell us more about what you're doing at the Berkeley Institute?
Well, I mean, we're doing all sorts of stuff. We've done these studies showing that there are people who have been together 20, 30, 40 years who are still intensely in love. We did a big survey with Dan O'Leary, a colleague of mine at Stony Brook, 4 or 5 years ago, in which we found that 40% of people who'd been married 10 years or longer claimed that they were very intensely in love. Now you have to understand that's 40% of people still together after 10 years. So it means about 20, but still, that means you have a 20% chance. But are they just saying this? And so we did a brain scan study of people who claim to be very intensely in love. We've done a lot of brain scan studies of people who've just fallen in love. We know what the brain looks like when you fall in love. You get this response that's like, it's like a response to cocaine. It's the same brain area. It's not that our brains are wired to respond to cocaine. They're wired to respond to some big, opportunity, and cocaine hits it. Well, one of the big opportunities is someone to fall in love with. So what we found is that when we looked at people who'd been together for 20 years, many of these were 60, 70 years old, who claimed to be intensely in love, their brains, when they looked at each other in the scanner, looked like people who'd just fallen in love. So it can exist. And so a big study that I'm working on now with various collaborators is, okay, so how can we make that happen? How can we make more people have that experience after years and years of being together, of being intensely in love? And so we're pulling together various data sets, longitudinal data sets that have been gathered and trying to analyze. So that's one project we're working on. Another project we're working on is, we know a whole bunch of what makes people initially attracted to each other, but not much about what leads from that initial attraction to who actually ends up in a relationship. So we've collected data both at Stony Brook and at Berkeley, where we had students, these were with students, tell us about, like all the intro psych students or something, tell us about is there anyone you're attracted to at the moment, and so forth. And then we follow up 6 months later and see if they formed a relationship. And when we initially asked them about it, we asked them various questions about it. And so we're analyzing those data to see what predicts who will actually form a relationship. Some of the things are not what you'd expect. Turns out that how attractive the person is doesn't matter that much. And that's because you wouldn't be initially attracted to them. These are all people you're initially attracted to. So what does still matter, though, is feeling that they're interested in you. And another thing that matters clearly is feeling they're not interested in other people initially, and that you don't, so that's another thing we're looking at right now. We have a lot of different studies going on. So it's kind of fun to be continuing this work. So any other questions right now?
Yes. Along with like the successful relationships, we were wondering, like, what's your view on the greatest roadblocks or problems people fail to address in relationships that ultimately lead them to be unhappy?
Yeah, there's 4 or 5 things that really undermine relationships. One is something people don't want to hear about, and that's yourself. If you are anxious or depressed or insecure, it's really hard to have a relationship with anyone. You may feel it's all their fault because initially it may work, but one of the biggest things you can do if you're anxious or depressed or insecure is to get therapy, or if it's extreme, get medication, or if it's not that extreme, learn to meditate. but do something to make yourself better. And also your partner, but it's yourself that matters most for your happiness. A second thing that's very important is how much stress you're under. Relationships are really hard for people who live in crime-ridden neighborhoods or who are, poor, but just any kind of stressors are really hard on relationships. And you have to understand, if you're under stress, there's a tendency to, when some big stressor happens, you fail a test or you do really badly at something, that you have to understand that when you talk to your partner, you're likely not to be thinking at your best. And you're likely to accuse your partner of things or just not, see the big picture. And a third thing is, of course, another thing is your family and peer group. If they disapprove of your relationship, it's really hard to make it work. I mean, it depends a little on the culture, but almost all cultures, peers matter, and in some cultures, parents and family matter a lot. And so if you can sort of keep them happy with it, that's worth doing. And then one of the biggest things is your communication skills. All relationships have conflicts and problems, and how you handle it and how much, and a big thing is just to listen to your partner and be responsive. And I mean, there's a lot we know, don't kitchen sink, as it's called. If you're upset with them about one thing, don't then bring up everything else that, they've done, or, that sort of thing. Try to be, one of the things some new research has shown is try to take the perspective of a neutral third party who cares about your relationship, but, is not on one side or the other. Try to think it out from their perspective as you, interact. And if things get really heated in an argument, take a break, but do come back to it, but take a break. Let things settle down so your heart isn't pushing too hard at you. So those are some of the things that are really hard on a relationship.
So, okay, when someone has an okay relationship, what are some things they can do to, spice things up or make it more passionate? And should they even bother?
Absolutely. Relationships are really important, and how much you enjoy. The quality of your relationship is a bigger predictor of how long you'll live than smoking or obesity, or it's like a huge factor. And of course, it's the biggest factor in our life. Happiness is how our relationships are. So what can you do to spice them up? Well, one thing is to do something novel and challenging every week or two with your partner. But some other things you can do. One thing is very simple. It's not my research, but I like it a lot. The studies show, it's called capitalization. Celebrate your partner's successes. If they have something good happen, they get do really well in an exam or something really good happens, don't just say, oh, that's nice. But you have to be sincere. You don't want to be over the top, but celebrate it with them. It really matters. It matters more than supporting them when things go badly, which is also important. But celebrating their successes. My wife and I follow the research really closely on relationships because we're both involved in it, but we also act on it. And I had recently just read this new paper on capitalization, and a paper we'd submitted. She was the first author, and it was mostly her work on the highly sensitive person stuff, to a very top journal. We didn't think it'd have much chance. It came in, and I was at home when the email came in. She was out, and I saw the editors had loved it, the reviewers had loved it, so they're going to accept it. So I made a poster and put it on the front door for when she came home. We had a great night, It was like, so that's another one. Another one is friends, is couple friends are really good for relationships. And expressing gratitude. Letting your partner know, again, you don't want to be over the top for every little thing, but letting them know you appreciate what they do, and appreciate it in the sense of how much benefit you get from it. And it turns out it matters. There's some new research showing when you express gratitude to your partner in an ongoing, it's not in a new relationship, it's important to let them know you're aware of how hard they work. In a long-term relationship, it's important to let them know how much you benefited from what they did. So those are some of the biggies that we now have on things you can do to really spice it up.
Thank you for that. keep that in mind.
Yeah.
But we were wondering, is there any, I think you touched upon it, but is there anything that like is kind of strange or interesting that you found out from all the years that you studied that most people wouldn't expect when they think about relationships, connections, and love?
Well, it's one of those things that once you may not have thought of it, and then once you get the results, you say, oh, well, I guess that makes sense. But, the importance of doing exciting activities we hadn't realized would be quite that important. Another one I think was, we talk about this idea of self-expansion, that, you're attracted to people because you want to increase who you are. Well, it turns out that that sort of goes against the notion of wanting someone who's similar. So what we found is, and this was a study we did some years ago at Stony Brook, and it's now been replicated. If you think you can form a relationship with someone, it would work out, you actually prefer someone who's different. Now, not different in the sense of if you're healthy, they're sick, but I mean different if you have different interests. So if you're into science and they're into the arts, if you think it would work, that's actually an advantage. And that was sort of it occurred to us that might be the case, but we were surprised the results came out that way. The brain scan studies we did, we found some interesting, surprising things. We were surprised about those studies of long-term relationships, how strong some of those are. One of my former graduate students, now pretty successful, she did this as her dissertation, the brain scan study, and she interviewed the couples first to see if they really, were talking about, did seem to believe they were intensely in love. She talked about this one couple that was sitting and talking to her and saying, this was a couple who was 70 years old, saying, we really annoy our friends because we're always all over each other physically. So it can happen. So, yeah. There's probably things too, but those are a few things that were striking to us.
So there are many books and podcasts, music, lots of things in the media promote prescriptions for love. Do you have any recommendations?
Well, there's a new book that just came out by Gary Lewandowski, who was a graduate student of mine at Stony Brook. And it just came out. I forget what it's called, but if you look it up, it's about 10 sort of misunderstandings we have about relationships that we could improve to make our relationships better. And it's a great book. There's another book, I think it's called The Marriage Hack by Eli Finkel, which is very good. And those are a couple examples of things I think are useful.
Is the book Stronger Than You Think? The 10 blind spots that undermine your relationship?
That's it. That's the one. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. And of course, if you happen to be a highly sensitive person, 20-30% of the population are what we call highly sensitive. It's my wife has a book called Sensitive and in Love, and by Lane Aaron.
And we're actually at our last scheduled question, which is, do you have any last advice or message for our audience?
Well, I think it's pay attention to your relationship. Don't just say it's okay. Try to correct the things. I mentioned some of the things to deal with, and try to take advantage of the things you can do to make it better. So I would say it's worth putting attention on it because it really can make your life better. And if things go badly, it really can make your life worse. Relationships matter a lot.
Thank you. And we actually have a few questions from the audience. So Sarah was asking, what are common things you see in unsuccessful relationships, and how do you know when it's time to call it quits?
Well, I mean, as I went through some of the things you see in unsuccessful relationships, and a huge one is oneself. I would say and of course, not being able to handle conflicts or things well, one can, marital counseling is really worth having. I think calling it quits, if things seem reasonable in other ways and there's no abuse, obviously if there's an abuse, that's the time to call it quits. I mean, abuse is not anything to stand for. But if there's no abuse going on, I think it's worth getting marital therapy, or if it's, and seeing if that helps. And if that doesn't help, then, then it's time to probably quit.
So we have another question. It's from, is it Hareni? Hareni? I'm sorry if I'm.
I think it's just Harney.
Harney?
Mhm.
Okay. So they asked, how does one overcome an avoidant attachment style?
It's tough. And there are two things. One thing, of course, is therapy. Therapy actually can help. And of course, if you have a secure partner who's willing to stay with you, that also can help. They can there's something called earned security, that people who had, childhood that led them to be, or some, terrible experiences that led them to be insecure, it is possible to overcome that. And we have lots of research showing, but therapy is designed to do that. And so is having a really supportive partner is designed to do that. So that's probably the best way to overcome it.
And earlier, Sarah asked, how do you keep things fresh and new during the pandemic? Or how have you found, if there are any ways that we could do that?
Well, I mean, it's harder, obviously, during the pandemic to do things that are fresh and novel. And if you're living with your partner, it's important to give each other a little space. But it's also important to do new things. You can take a cooking class together if you've never done that. You can, certainly if, I don't know what the weather's like there right now, but going out for hikes or walks in new places. Again, doing something novel via Zoom with people. Like, as I said, doing something with another couple, doing the 36 questions with another couple can be, or even trying to, write a play together. And of course, people also are telling us that I won't go into our relationship, but telling us that they're doing various sorts of, role playing in their bedroom situation. Anything that's novel and interesting and different. It doesn't have to be, hang gliding or something like that. But although, there are things you can do outdoors if it's comfortable enough, skiing or whatever, that can be new if you don't do them all the time. And even, watching a movie or something like that, if it's new and different and is appealing to both of you and very engaging and exciting, that can also be useful.
So Edwin asked how the questions in the 36 question studies were created.
They were created, some of it was just thinking out what would be appropriate. There was a book at the time, I think, called The Ungame, that had a book that was somewhat popular way back then when we did this study, and we took some questions from that. And we just, played at it. And actually, my wife and I have continued to play at it a little because we like to keep doing this with other couples, and we don't want to use the same questions all the time. So we've invented some different ones, but it's not that hard. The idea is to have questions that at the beginning are not very threatening to talk about, that are very, who would you have for, anyone in the world in history as a partner for dinner, and then, but towards the end, how would you feel if your mother died, or, some very, difficult questions. You also have to adjust the questions for the context a little bit. We did one study of having police and community members in a rather tense community do the 36 questions in pairs. And we realized after a little bit of piloting, we needed to remove all the questions about death. It was just too hard for the police. But.
Next question is, what's the best advice you could give to a couple in a long distance relationship?
I think, it turns out there is some research on this. Communicate regularly, of course, and video is better than just, audio. I have a former grad student who's just gotten a grant to look at virtual reality for couples at a distance, which once that's available, that could be a good thing to have even a deeper link. But I think that's the main one, is to, and keep your relationship front and center to the extent you can, and do things together. You can watch a video together at a distance, or things like that. And you can, again, do things with another couple. 4 of you can be on different computers and do things. When we do this as a foursome, 2 couples, each of the 4 of you answers each question. Then you go on to the next one and the next one. And you want to remember that if you try doing these 36 questions, you don't try to do all 36. They're in 3 sets of 12. You spend 15, 20 minutes on the first set and then go as many as you get through slowly. You don't rush it. And then you go to the second set and so forth. Otherwise, you'll be a whole day on just the first set of questions.
Harveni asks if there's a difference when the 36 questions are presented virtually, as in over text, or in person.
Well, there is some research on that. Sue Sprecher has done a number of studies comparing them. It turns out that it's almost as good to do them by video or even audio as to do it in person, but it's not as good to do it by text. It doesn't have the same effect. The audio or the video is really, the video is the best, other than in person. The video is almost as good as in person. But again, just text, it turns out, it still works, but doesn't work nearly as well.
So Stephanie had a question about falling in love with love versus the person. Do you have any advice on differentiating the two?
Well, it's, and of course there are people who fall out of love with love, but they fall in love with someone in spite of it. It's, the excitement of forming a relationship is really a wonderful thing for people. And sometimes people want it and don't really care about the relationship. But I think, you have to look at, who is this you're falling in love with, and what will you get from it? How will your life, if you form a relationship, how will your life be better? And I think focusing on that helps you sort those things out. But there's nothing wrong with falling in love with someone if it doesn't form a relationship, as long as they don't feel rejected or something. Falling in love is something that's really central to our lives. And in fact, it's interesting, it occurs as frequently in 6, 7, 8-year-olds as in teenagers and in young adults. Most of you who are listening, probably, if you think back, fell in love once as a child, at least once. Not all of you, but most of you probably, we don't always call it love, but it turns out that it's pretty much the same thing. It doesn't have the sexual component, but sometimes falling in love as an adult doesn't have a sexual component. People fall in love with someone of a gender they're not comfortable with or don't feel interested in, but yet they still fall in love. So it's the brain areas suggest there's a difference. They go together, but usually, but not always in adults.
So we have another question from the audience. Kimberly asks, what do you think about the idea of having to love yourself before getting into a relationship?
I think it's helpful to feel comfortable with yourself. I don't know quite what's meant with love yourself, but if you are having a hard time, if you're really anxious or depressed, it's going to be hard to have any relationship. But the relationship could help you cope with it too. If the other person's willing to put out and you're willing to deal with it. It's so easy if you're down to blame things that happen on the other person. So it's a tricky situation. Certainly, getting therapy or medication or learning to meditate or doing something to deal with it is really valuable in general, but certainly for any relationship, whether you're in it or want to be in it.
What do you think about complete transparency with your intimate partner?
Well, I don't know of much research on that directly. It depends a little on the stage of your relationship. In an early stage, it might be more appropriate not to reveal everything. I'm just breaking up another relationship or whatever. As you get into it, it's tricky. If you've, flirted with someone inappropriately, should you tell your partner? Well, from an ethical point of view, you should. But in terms of the relationship, it's mixed. It just depends. Sometimes it's better if they don't know, better for your relationship. But you have to weigh that against the ethical side of, am I lying to them? Is that going to hurt us, hurt me?
Do you have a personal opinion on it? Or what have you practiced in life, if you care to share that, if that's too...
You want me to be completely transparent here?
I mean, it might be too soon in our relationship, but...
Right. No, I mean, I lean to the ethical side, but it's tricky, but it's my wife and I have an understanding that we've had from early on that we sort of laid out what the limits are, and we promised we'd tell the other if we go beyond them, but we don't have to tell if we don't go beyond them. So.
And then, because you've been married for so long, do you have like 3 core tenets of marriage that you'd care to share with us?
Well, I sort of went through what I think are the core things. There's being, handling stress well and handling conflicts well and having couple friendships, and then there's doing the things to spice it up that I went through. Doing exciting activities and capitalization, that is, celebrating your partner's successes and those sorts of things. So, those are the things we try to do. We follow as I mentioned, we follow the research. Anytime something comes out that suggests something good for relationships, we jump at it and use it ourselves, as well as our own research, of course.
So an audience member asked if how could she get involved with the type of studies that you've been doing, or if you have any recommendations for any classes that you could take at Stony Brook.
Well, when I was there, I used to teach close relationships. I don't know if I haven't looked at the current thing, but usually close relationships is taught every year or two as an undergraduate upper level course. Usually it's required that you've taken intro psych first, but I'm not sure. But it's a fairly standard course at most universities. And I think, when I was there, I taught it mostly, but I think others are probably teaching it. There's some good faculty members at Stony Brook who certainly are competent and capable of teaching relationships. And it's always a course that attracts a huge number of students.
Sounds good. Jules, do you have any other questions you want to ask? I think that pretty much wraps up today's panel. Mm-hmm.
Thank you for your questions and the opportunity to share what we know.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah. Joining us. Yes.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Do you have any like social media or contact or any studies you want to share before we leave the call?
Most of my stuff are, scientific papers, and I'm not sure that would be that useful to people. So I think I mentioned a couple books that are pretty good, and they all mention some of my research as well as other, mostly other people's too, but yeah. So I think that's sufficient.
Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to the audience for coming out. This is the end of our event. And if you have any questions, feel free to stay on. But hope you guys have a good night.